Welcome to Sandy Says. My name is Sandy Dimiterchik, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Hank Weisinger, a clinical psychologist and author of books about work. Dr. Weisinger, please introduce yourself. I understand from the book I read that not only are you an accomplished writer, but you are also a speaker and consultant for programs like executive MBA programs.
Yeah, I have been in the field of psychology for many, many, many years and have enjoyed it. Have worked with a lot of different types of populations, from clinical in hospitals in my early days, and then went into the corporate world, teaching at business schools and getting into subjects like emotional intelligence and giving and taking criticism and performing under pressure and anger. These were all subjects that I saw in clinical situations that were giving people trouble. And I just took those same subjects and the expertise I was developing and transitioned myself into the corporate world. And I
Okay,
liked it. It was fun.
great, great. And how many books have you written so far?
Oh, I'd say about maybe 11 or 12.
That's great. Well, today we're mainly talking about the book Emotional Intelligence at Work. I recently finished reading this book and I found it very helpful. I hold a monthly job networking group and I know I am always being asked for resources like this book. I know it is for the general public, but I really liked how you provided case scenarios and practice exercises. How were you inspired to do that, and what are your goals for the books you have written about?
Well, I'll tell you the backstory of that book. I had written a book on anger that was called Dr. Weisinger's Anger Workout Book that came out in 1985, and it literally became, among the mental health professionals, a very popular book because at that time, the what I found in the therapeutic world is that people, when they had a patient who had an anger issue, they would talk about it. But the therapist was not skilled in the sense of, here are the actions that you need to be able to take. So I started looking at managing anger, and therapists always saying you got to work out your anger. So that's how, in Jane Fonda's book, her workout book was hot at the time, and that's how I came up with the title. I'm calling it like an anger workout book. And then I took that subject and I took it into the corporate world and wrote a book called Anger at Work. And what I should have called it was Emotions at Work, because as we know, anger has a very negative connotation. I would have copies of that book go up at airports as a way of promoting it and say, "Hey, sir, I thought you'd like a copy of my new book, Anger at Work." And the standard reaction would be, "Do I look like an angry person?" and so on. And when I would call up companies, "I'd like to speak to your managers on the subject of managing anger. Nobody's angry here. Don't call us anymore." Then Daniel Goleman came out with his book, Emotional Intelligence. And I remember one of my friends said, "Look at Time magazine." And it was on the cover. And I felt sick because I said, you know what? I knew I should have called my book Emotions at Work rather than Anger at Work. I was just using anger as an emotion that most people have trouble with, as a metaphor for dealing with emotions. So I immediately, as soon as I saw emotional intelligence, immediately wrote Emotional Intelligence at Work.
Hmm.
And that is how that book came to be. And at that time, must have been about 1995, nobody in the corporate world was really speaking on that subject because it was fresh. But I had been talking about emotional intelligence, just not calling it that. Criticism giving and taking criticism, for example, is a microcosm of emotional intelligence, because if I'm going to criticize you, I have to be sensitive to your emotions, how you're reacting. I have to be able to manage my emotions because a lot of times when we give criticism, it comes from anger rather than really trying to help the other person. So you have to be able to manage your emotions, deal with the other person's emotions, and so on. So it's really a microcosm. So I've been talking about emotional intelligence for years and years and years before that label was used. And then I learned about the theory of emotional intelligence from the guys who created it, John Mayer, University of New Hampshire, Peter Salve, who's currently president or provost at Yale. And I started to see my work as an application of their theory.
Well, I know the book came out a while back, but I was wondering if the theories about emotional intelligence are pretty much the same or have they changed?
Well, one of the bad things about emotional intelligence, unfortunately, is turned into a business. And anybody can talk on the subject and anybody can make up their own theory. But from my perspective, no, the theory has not changed, but perhaps it is expanding into new areas. Now, you know, cognitive psychologists, neuropsychologists looking at the brain and how the brain deals with emotions and so on has become more and more. I have no interest in that. I have no interest in the psychophysiology, of the brain and what happens when you experience certain types of emotions. I leave that for the more science-oriented psychologists who really wanted to be doctors but didn't get into medical school. They can have all that stuff. I'm not interested in that.
A while
And the
back,
reason is
hmm
because of the process, excuse me, of cognitive appraisal, how you interpret things. The brain is going to do what it does, but there's a mediating process. You and I can both look at the same event and have different interpretations of it. And those different interpretations will lead us to a different physical response and a different behavioral type of response. It's like if you go to a football game, you're sitting on an angle, the field goal looks wide. But if you're sitting right behind the goalpost, it looks perfect, right through it. So just like where you sit physically determines your physical perspective, where you sit emotionally will determine your emotional perspective, how
hmm
you interpret things.
A while back, I interviewed Maggie Mullen, the author of the book Dialectical Behavior Therapy Skills for Psychosis. I think this was an important book because there has been a change in attitude about providing therapy to people with schizophrenia-related disorders. Do you think people with these diagnoses will benefit from reading your book? If so, how?
So much has changed in the area of schizophrenia. So let me first say that is far from my expertise. Um, so I would say that it depends on the state. If you're asking me if somebody who is in as a with has a clinical diagnosis as a paranoid schizophrenic, I would say no, um, just because of the thinking and what is going on. So I think to be able to use the book, uh, that you have to, uh, if you, regardless of what your disorder is, whether manic depression, whatever, you have to have the cognitive capabilities to be able to focus and pay attention, and you have to have the ability to interact with people effectively. And if those two criteria are met, then I think um, people can benefit from the book. Yeah. on that.
Okay, that's
One of
great.
the things, you're one of the rare people who picks up that book and, just goes through it. Because at times, if I had to write that book now, I'd write it very differently, try to make it even more accessible and so on. But it's not a book that has to be read all at once.
Right, right.
And that's what I want your audience to know. You can break it down and you can just read a few pages, and then you can try some of the suggestions, some of the communication principles, some of the ways of managing your emotions.
Have you ever considered writing about working skills like emotional intelligence for people with disabilities? Are you familiar with the new subset of workers called neurodiverse? And what recommendations can you make? Would a book on managing people with disabilities be helpful?
I'm sure it would, but I would lack the expertise to be able to write that. Although there was a professor when I was at the University of Kansas in graduate school, Beatrice Wright, and she was actually the founder of rehabilitative psychology. She would have been a person who could have written a working book for disabilities. But back then, nobody was really thinking, like that and so on. But that would be an important book to write. What I have found, and I've done some reading on this, is that it's like when a parent has a child who has a disability, a frequent occurrence is anger. It comes out of frustration. And this is where managers, if they're managing, working with people who have disabilities, have to be very self-aware. Because what happens is they get angry at the disability. And that becomes really counterproductive. That would be like getting angry at your child who has ADHD because they can't concentrate. Or that would be like a therapist getting angry at an alcoholic because the alcoholic lied. But that's what they do. That's the part of the dysfunction. So I think that to work effectively with people who have disabilities, physical disabilities, mental disability. I don't even like that word, but you really have to uh, have a attitude of inclusiveness and empathy and and I'm not saying compassion, because it's not a question of feeling sorry or relating to the person. It's a question of being more empathic, of understanding what they might be experience. A person who has a physical disability, for like in walking, how many times when I used to have to take my mother and she'd be with a walker and so on. And in retrospect, when I would say, "Mommy, hurry up," and so on, now I feel bad that I said that. How could she hurry up? She's on a walker, 75 years old, 80 years old, and so on. So that's why I'm saying that you have to be empathic. It's not that I felt sorry for her, but I would need to understand that she's doing the best that she can be doing.
I was interested in the sections of the book about managing emotions and motivation. In our support groups, we remind members that while we're not responsible for our illness, we are responsible for our responses. I think you mentioned in the book many skills that would help a person with schizophrenia. What do you think?
I think if again it goes back to that question of to what degree is
Mm-hmm,
the schizophrenia, influencing them? I mean, a catatonic is not going to benefit from this book.
mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think the skills for the person who is working, whether they are schizophrenic or whether they are not, the skills are equally important in terms of managing emotions. Uh, one of the things that I would recommend that is a very easy strategy to use is practicing relaxation on a daily basis. Because when you practice relaxation on a daily basis, it makes it easier to stay relaxed in a pressure situation or in a stressful situation, whether that stress is in a work situation or whether it's having to do 10 errands, in during the course of a day. I think another good strategy that is is very easy for people to use is just to start to pay attention to how they talk to themselves. Here's a tip. If you are experiencing distress, that is to use the distress as a cue that it is time to re-examine your thinking. So every time you feel, whether it's anger, anxiety, any type of psychological discomfort, that you immediately check on your thoughts, how you're talking to yourself. And what people will find out is 100% of the time, their thoughts are not helping them. They're basically speaking negatively to themselves. One of the, I think affirmations, one of the strategies that I think is very useful is to write down on a 5x8 card restatements that if you say these statements when you wake up in the morning, it puts you in a good mood. Remember the movie? Did you see Jerry Maguire?
Mm-hmm.
I love getting up in the morning. Now, who has a better day? The person who says, I love getting up in the morning, or the person who says, oh God, I can't stand my job and I hate it, and so on. So when I say, see, this was like in the anger workout book. This is what I found people do not want to do. They don't want to take the time to write the statements down on a 3x5 card because they think it's silly, it's hokey, and so on. They don't want to take action. I remember it's like people would say, oh, I got Jane Fonda's workout video, and they'd watch it while they're lying in bed. Is that going to help? You have to do it. You have to be able to take action. And I think it's important. And one of the things I say is never expect support from people you work with, especially from your manager. If you get anything from them, consider it it's a miracle. So what people have to do is give themselves support and create an infrastructure of support. And one of the ways people can do that is to write down statements that make them feel good and put them in high visibility places. So you are immediately putting yourself into a positive frame of reference.
Well, I was also struck by your setback section. That was really interesting to read as a person with schizophrenia who struggled for so many years to find the right medication. When I read it at first, I was like, wow, this is like such a short amount of time to get over stuff. I know for me, it took me a lot longer just because I had to find the right medication. But I liked your ideas about overcoming setbacks, not staying stuck in it. And we
You know,
have in our blue book, we have an article on setbacks and stigma, and I think your ideas on overcoming them would be helpful for anybody. Well, as you mentioned already, being realistic about the different levels of the schizophrenia spectrum. So setbacks for one person might be different and last longer than for another person.
absolutely. And
Right.
one of the things that I have learned, everybody goes through that process differently. It's like when you lose a loved one. Now, and I'll use like when my father died. When I think about it, it literally took me 4 or 5 years until I reached a point where every time I thought about him was positive and there was no sadness. Some people takes longer, some people faster. And what I found as a therapist, you cannot rush people through that process. Now, what I would like to say to people, okay, you've had a setback and so on. I say, you know what? You have you can you can feel bad about that, you can get depressed about that, and so on. Um, like for a week. After that, it's time to move on. Now you can still feel bad about that. Keep that all like take 20 minutes out of your day to feel bad, but let's use the rest of your day to move on. Not minimizing the thing, but saying, okay, but you can't deny it. One of the things, the mistakes that I have found that people do dealing with difficult feelings and emotions is they try to rush over them, suppress them, rather than experience them and allow themselves to feel the hurt. You can't have a loving relationship with somebody and then when it ends expect to feel no grief. That's that's the trade-off. It's like, not to compare the two, but it's like when a person loses, a lot of people don't want to get a second dog because they don't want to have to go through it when their dog dies again. That's the problem with having a pet. And when you're in a loving relationship or you lose a parent or God forbid, a child and so on, that is something that the best way to heal that is to experience it so that you can sort of move through it. And it might never feel good, but you can still, I learned people can still move on. I remember my biggest setback, I think, was when my first book was uh, bought by a publisher, and then the editor got fired, and they brought in a new editor, and they canceled the book. I stayed in bed for 2 days.
Yeah.
I was like, 30 years old, and all of a sudden, the idea of going on Johnny Carson has now disappeared right in front of me, and so on. And then I came back.
That's wonderful. So, what topics do you hope to write about in the future?
The right now I'm doing a series of little guides on handling pressure in different situations. I'm doing one called Testing Under Pressure, which is now on Amazon. And it's not just for students, it's for anybody, whether they have to take a professional certification test, a teacher's licensing test. A lot of people, quote, choke when that big test comes. Doing another one that just went into production for athletes called Choke Proof Your Game, which is a playbook for beating pressure. And the one that my friends are excited about, that I personally think could be a Netflix series, is called The Dating Matrix, an unvarnished look at dating after 60. Hitchcock would think it's one of the greatest horror stories he's ever read in his life. So that is the fun book that I am writing.
Well, do you have any other comments?
Um, any other comments? I think that I would like the most in the message that I try to give my kids, and what I would want the your audience to always remember, that I have found the most important attribute in navigating yourself effectively in life is believing in yourself. That's what I would like people to do, to have confidence uh, in themselves, and believe in themselves. And that to me is the human spirit, and to have hope. To quote my friend Andy Dufresne, who from the Shawshank Redemption, hope is the best of all possible things, and no good thing ever dies. So yeah, and I think that's what we need now as a country is hope. And remember what hope is. It's attaching yourself to something that is positive. In the future, people get depressed when they see no hope. So when people are feeling down, especially if I'm a manager and my staff is dejected, one of the things I want to do is to create hope for them. And one of the ways you do that, there's two important concepts here. You know, the old expression where there's a will, there's a way. Well, the will is your sense of agency. Everybody needs to have a sense of agency, meaning empowerment within themselves, self empowerment, rather than waiting for other people to advocate for you. Take charge. And pathways, when they say there's a way, is to think of all the different resources that you have that can help you reach your goal. So I would say, oh, if I can start out when I have a new book coming out thinking this could never be a bestseller and get depressed, but I'll create hope when I say, well, I know I have a lot of contacts in the business world and the mental health world. I know a lot of TV people, a lot of radio people. And now as I'm opening up all these pathways, all these resources, I become excited. A football team is terrible. Then all of a sudden they get a new quarterback. They get a new wide receiver. And all of a sudden the fans, hey, they become excited because now we have hope. So, and when hope is gone, that to me is the worst of the human condition. So that would be a comment, is to build hope within yourself.
Well, thank you so much for being on the interview today. Thanks for attending Sandy Says. Make sure you subscribe to the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance channel so you don't miss a Sandy Says video. Thanks. Bye.